Inside room 2141 of the U.S. Capitol, Jasmine Crockett and Daniel Cameron clash in a live, high-stakes hearing over a haunting question. Did he bury justice to protect the men who killed Breonna Taylor? Cameron tries to deflect with legal jargon and polished denial, but just minutes later, Jasmine drops a sealed email, a whistleblower letter, and a smoking gun timeline that no one can unsee. Cameron is forced back under federal investigation, and the system that once protected him starts to unravel on live TV. Now the nation's asking, what did Jasmine expose that left even his allies speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Outside the Rayburn building, protest banners fluttered in the wind like flags at half-mast. The steps were packed with survivors, organizers, and quietly enraged citizens holding signs that read, "Say her name, and silence is not justice." But inside room 2141, the lights were colder, harsher. This wasn't a protest. It was a courtroom with congressional teeth. The placard above the chair read, "House Judiciary Subcommittee Hearing, Reform After Breonna Taylor." And presiding over it, Jasmine Crockett, seated at the center dais in a charcoal blazer with no jewelry, no distractions. Just a sharpened gaze and a stack of sealed files in front of her, like legal landmines. Her posture was still, but her presence crackled with voltage. This wasn't about party lines. It was about the line of trust America watched disappear the night Breonna Taylor died in her sleep. At precisely 9:01 a.m., the back doors opened. The cameras spun. Daniel Cameron, former Attorney General of Kentucky, stepped into the chamber to a storm of camera flashes. His navy blue suit was crisp, the lapel pin intact, but the weight of recent defeat hung like a second coat. He had just lost the gubernatorial race in his home state, undone not by policy failures, but by the lingering, festering shadow of Breonna Taylor's name and his role in bearing the truth. The hearing room, filled to capacity with lawmakers, staffers, and quiet fury, felt like a courtroom without walls. On the hallway monitor outside, someone had pinned a freshly printed headline from the Washington Post, enlarged and underlined in red Sharpie, "Cameron's Fall from Power, the Cost of Choosing Silence." He took his seat at the witness table, fingers curling once, twice against the wood. He didn't look up at the photo displayed behind the dais, a framed portrait of Breonna Taylor, overlaid with the words, "131 days without charges, a lifetime without justice." And then came the detail no PR team could spin. A public statement from a former grand juror in Cameron's own case, now entered into the record. A single sentence echoed in the room as Jasmine read it aloud. "We were never even told we could consider homicide charges. That decision was made before we ever sat down." The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was political gravity. A system had closed its eyes. And now, for the first time, its architect was sitting under oath, across from a woman who refused to blink. He leaned into the microphone with practiced calm, his shoulders squared, his voice steady, almost too steady. "I know what's been said about me," he began, eyes locked forward, avoiding the photo of Breonna Taylor projected behind him like it might burn. "But the role of an attorney general is not to deliver vengeance. It is to follow the law." His words were slow, deliberate, each syllable weighed down with legalism, stripped of empathy. "And in this case," he continued, "there simply was not enough evidence to bring a homicide charge under Kentucky statute. That is not a political decision. That is a prosecutorial boundary." He paused just long enough for the discomfort to settle. Then came the line that turned stomachs. "Justice cannot be dictated by grief. It is not a reaction to public outrage." A rustle ran through the room. Jasmine didn't blink, but the muscle in her jaw tightened. A woman in the back sobbed, barely, but it was loud in the silence. Cameron pressed on, now leaning into the framing of restraint as virtue. "If we allow emotions to shape indictments, we abandon the law. And I won't do that. Not for headlines, not for hashtags." He spoke as if his voice alone could will away the weight of what wasn't done. But around him, every sentence felt less like an explanation and more like a defense built on technicalities instead of truth. And somewhere in the middle of that chamber, Breonna Taylor's name hung heavier than any law he'd just cited. As the last syllable of his denial faded into silence, Daniel Cameron reached for what many officials do when truth tightens its grip. He reached for numbers, hoping they'd speak louder than the names he wouldn't. He opened a folder with deliberate calm, slid a single page forward, and raised it just high enough for the cameras to catch. This data, he began, comes from the National Prosecutors Council and several peer-reviewed judicial audits. In over 60% of grand jury cases where public pressure plays a role, the outcomes are challenged, often reversed. His voice was steady, perhaps too steady, coated in the authority of bureaucracy, but stripped of any human register. That is why I chose caution over chaos, he continued, because when we allow grief to dictate the law, we lose not just clarity, but justice itself. He looked directly at the panel, but not at the gallery behind them, not at the faces that had come to witness what the law so often refused to see. A mother clutched her purse, her eyes fixed not on the paper in his hand, but on the void he represented. A retired nurse in the third row muttered under her breath, "We're not numbers." And she was right. The room remained still, not out of respect, but out of the quiet disbelief that follows the familiar. Because they had heard it before. When Trayvon Martin was labeled a threat, when Eric Garner was called non-compliant, when Breonna Taylor became a footnote to procedure. Cameron wasn't offering new information. He was offering a polished version of a very old excuse. To the public, to the families in that room, he did not sound like a man invoking the law. He sounded like a man invoking distance. Distance from the body, the gunshots, the bedroom floor soaked in blood, the unanswered 911 call, and that, more than the statistic itself, was the betrayal. Not that the system failed, but that the man entrusted to fix it had learned how to defend its failure with a straight face. The numbers had been laid down. The legal citations, the cold rationale, the polished deflection. But the air in room 2141 had shifted, because somewhere between the silence and the statistics, the truth had gone missing. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She raised the volume of what no one else had dared to play. With deliberate calm, she tapped the audio button embedded in her panel. The overhead monitors dimmed slightly, and a soft crackle of static signaled the moment was no longer under anyone's control. Not even Daniel Cameron's. Then the voice came. "We were never presented with any option to consider homicide. We were only instructed to review wanton endangerment. Distorted to protect the identity of the speaker, but real. The voice of a member of the grand jury that Cameron once claimed had made their decision freely and independently. The words weren't theatrical, they were plain, dry, unemotional, and that's what made them land like gunfire." Jaws tightened across the dais. A woman in the gallery, Breonna Taylor's aunt, brought her hand to her mouth. One of the younger staffers behind the panel dropped his notepad and didn't even bother to pick it up. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't explain. She let the weight of the betrayal sit in the bones of every person in that room. The recording ended with a click. Then slowly she reached for a second document, an envelope bearing the seal of the Kentucky Bar Association's Ethics Committee. She opened it with both hands, unfolded the contents like evidence being submitted in a trial. Her tone remained steady, judicial, devastating. This letter was submitted by the Ethics Committee just 6 months after the Breonna Taylor case was closed at the state level. It includes formal concerns not from activists or journalists, but from senior members of Kentucky's own legal profession, stating that Attorney General Cameron exercised, quote, undue prosecutorial discretion, that he withheld from the grand jury critical charging options, violating ethical conduct and undermining the core function of the jury process. She paused, not for effect, but because there was nothing left to read. The words were simple. The implication was enormous. She turned, slowly, surgically, and locked eyes with Daniel Cameron. There was no tension in her shoulders, no emotion in her face. She was past that. This wasn't passion anymore. It was precision. "Mr. Cameron," she began, "you stood before the nation and told them you followed the law. You told grieving families that there wasn't enough evidence to go further, that the system had run its course. She held the document up between them, almost gently, a final nail in the box he had built for justice. But you didn't let the system run its course. You rerouted it. You narrowed the path until only one outcome was possible, and then you called that process. He didn't blink. You silenced a jury not because they lacked evidence, but because you feared what they might decide if they were given the full truth. The room was still. Even the clicking of cameras had stopped. When you conceal the most serious charge, homicide, from a grand jury, she said, voice low but clear, you are not exercising caution. You are not preserving the law. You are staging a conclusion, one written before the evidence was heard. A woman in the second row covered her mouth with both hands. Another stood, unaware she had done so. Crockett continued, never once raising her tone. You didn't fail to seek justice. You succeeded in avoiding it. You didn't defend the legal system. You choreographed it to protect power. She leaned in just slightly, not to intimidate, but to ensure every syllable was captured on record. You didn't just withhold justice from Breonna Taylor. You withheld the right of a jury to even consider if she deserved it. And then Jasmine Crockett stepped back from the mic, leaving only the paper in her hand, and a silence so loud it felt like thunder beneath glass. The silence after Jasmine's final words didn't simply linger. It grew roots, spreading through the chamber, like truth finally finding oxygen. And in that moment, Daniel Cameron did not refute it with facts. He reacted with something far more revealing. Anger. He shifted in his chair, the polished composure cracking just beneath the surface. The corner of his mouth twitched, half grimace, half restraint slipping. Then, without warning, his voice rang out, sharper, louder, no longer measured. I don't need to be lectured by someone who doesn't even live in Kentucky. The words hit the air with an edge that couldn't be unsaid. He stood now, hands flat against the witness table, his posture defensive, not in legal strategy, but in pride wounded. His tone swelled, no longer aiming for logic, but for territory. You come in here from Texas, wave some paper, play to the cameras, and think that gives you the right to question how we enforce justice in our state? He turned toward the committee, briefly gesturing as if to enlist their support, but no one moved. All eyes remained fixed on him, a man unraveling not because he had been falsely accused, but because he had run out of places to hide. I was elected to serve the people of Kentucky, he continued, voice straining now. I did what I believed was right under the law. I wasn't put in office to score points on social media. I wasn't put there to bend to mob emotion. He stopped, breathing heavily, his gaze returning to Jasmine Crockett. You act like you understand this better than me, but you weren't in those rooms. You weren't on those streets. You weren't the one carrying the weight. His eyes were burning with something between resentment and desperation, fighting not against the facts, but against the mirror she had just held up. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink. She let the moment breathe, let him fill it with every word he thought would shield him, until it became obvious that the more he spoke, the more alone he sounded. And across the room, in the stillness he'd tried to shatter, the truth echoed louder than any outburst ever could. He wasn't defending Kentucky. He was defending himself. From her, from the record, and from what he had chosen to leave out. With the truth cornering him and no facts left to stand on, Daniel Cameron did what power so often does when exposed. It didn't answer the charge. It attacked the voice speaking it. His expression tightened, the cool professionalism from earlier replaced by something far more familiar. Resentment. Not at what had been revealed, but at who had revealed it. He leaned into the microphone, not to clarify, not to defend, but to wound. Let's stop pretending this hearing is about justice, he said, his voice calm but laced with derision. It's a show, and frankly, I won't sit here and play a role in Madam Microphone's latest act. The words dropped like acid into the silence. A ripple moved through the chamber, not of agreement, but of recognition. He had gone personal, deliberately. The phrase wasn't new. It had first surfaced a year earlier, born from conservative cable shows and Twitter threads that took Jasmine Crockett's sharp, unfiltered presence in a congressional hearing and turned it into a caricature. Madam Microphone, a term soaked in sexism and dog whistle disdain, Was their way of saying too loud, too emotional, too much? To label her as noise rather than intellect, performance instead of substance, a black woman who dared to take up space, silence not with arguments, but with mockery. And now Cameron resurrected that nickname in the middle of a federal hearing, on record, under oath, not because it was true, but because it was easy, because the evidence had turned against him, because the questions had no safe answers. And so, he reached not for the law, but for a punchline. But the room didn't laugh. The press didn't type. The staffers didn't blink. Instead, the chamber held still in that cold, electric way it does when someone just showed the whole country who they really are. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't speak. But the heat in her silence said more than any rebuttal ever could. Because everyone had just seen it, not the exposure of a witness, but the collapse of a mask. Daniel Cameron wasn't refuting her. He was retaliating. And in doing so, he proved the very point he tried to dismiss. Cameron had hoped to dismiss her with a nickname, but in that moment, he didn't realize what Jasmine Crockett had brought wasn't just a voice. It was a receipt, and not metaphorical, literal. She didn't fire back with words. She didn't need to. Instead, Jasmine Crockett reached calmly into a thin, matte black folder. Her movement was quiet, almost surgical. The kind that doesn't announce an attack, only its precision. What emerged wasn't rhetoric. It was a document, one page, printed, highlighted, stamped. She held it aloft without flair. No grand gestures, just a steady hand and a voice sharp enough to slice through spin. This, she said, is a verified internal email from the Kentucky Law and Order Fund, a political action committee that supported your campaign. A murmur passed through the room. Jasmine didn't pause. It was sent exactly 21 days before your office announced no homicide charges in the death of Breonna Taylor. She read directly from the page, her voice unhurried but deliberate. Contribution needs to be expedited to ensure Cameron maintains communication stability in light of Breonna decision. Subject line, let's not anger the FOP before November. The phrase landed like a brick dropped on glass. Everyone in the room felt it. That sudden shift from political theory to naked transaction. The veneer cracked. She lowered the page slightly, allowing everyone a full view of it. The cameras zoomed in. One law clerk near the back audibly whispered, "That's game over." Jasmine continued, her eyes never leaving Cameron now. "So I ask you, Mr. Cameron, was it prosecutorial discretion that led you to withhold homicide charges from the grand jury?" Her tone was razor thin but steady, like a scalpel in a surgeon's grip. "Or was it this?" She lifted the email slightly higher. "A warning, a reminder, a payoff in plain text, warning you not to anger the Fraternal Order of Police before your next election." Cameron said nothing, but the color in his face changed. Not red with rage, but gray with calculation. His fingers curled on the table. Jasmine stepped forward, laying the page gently on the witness table in front of him. Not tossed, not thrown, placed like evidence. "You say you were bound by law, but this shows you were bound by politics. You say your hands were tied, but this shows they were held." The tension in the chamber now was suffocating. No one typed, no one shuffled. The quiet wasn't deference. It was pressure, building, inch by inch. She turned to the committee, slowly, as if bringing them into the weight of the moment. "We cannot allow silence to dress itself as legal integrity. Not when the paper trail leads straight through a dead girl's name to a campaign ledger." Then she looked back to Cameron, this time not as a congresswoman confronting a witness, but as a citizen speaking to power. "So I'll ask again, directly, and on the record." She paused, not to perform, but to give him nowhere to run. "Is this email, this money, this deadline, the reason Breonna Taylor never had her day in court?" The silence that followed wasn't absence. It was presence. The presence of something too real to dodge, too detailed to deny, too late to erase. And for the first time in that hearing, Daniel Cameron looked like a man no longer answering questions, but hearing them in his sleep. The receipts had landed, the evidence had spoken, and yet it wasn't enough. Because no matter how damning the paper trail was, there was still a voice missing from the table. A voice that had been ignored from the very beginning, until now. A quiet knock from the side door broke the tension. Jasmine Crockett gave a subtle nod. The clerk stepped aside, and from the hallway entered a woman whose name was written into the very foundation of that room's existence. Tamika Palmer, mother of Breonna Taylor, walked slowly, with the careful steps of someone who had carried too much grief for too long. She wasn't accompanied by lawyers, aides, or cameras. She didn't need them. Her presence alone recentered the room. A chair had been left for her beside the primary witness table. She lowered herself into it, one hand gripping the edge as if the furniture might dissolve beneath her. In her lap, a folded piece of paper. In her other hand, a photograph. Breonna, 26, beaming in hospital scrubs. When she reached for the microphone, her hand shook, but only slightly. The chamber, once bustling with subtext, stilled. Not out of decorum, out of gravity. "My name is Tamika Palmer," she began, her voice raw, dry, barely more than a whisper. "And I wasn't supposed to be here." No one moved. Every pair of eyes fixed on her. "I was supposed to be picking out centerpieces for my daughter's wedding. I was supposed to be helping her decorate a nursery when she was ready for kids. I was supposed to be a mother, not a mourner." She stopped, looking down at her own hands as if surprised they were still functioning. "But instead," she said, "I became a hashtag. I became a press conference. I became the mother of a girl whose name people chant, but whose case no one finished." Her eyes, now wet, rose and locked on the man seated feet away. "Mr. Cameron," she said, steady now, "I believed you." She paused, and the word believed hung in the air like a cracked foundation. "When you spoke at your first press conference, I thought, maybe he'll do the right thing. Maybe finally someone won't be afraid to say what we all already know, that what happened to Breonna was wrong." A deep breath, then a tremor in her voice. "But I didn't get a call from your office. I didn't get a visit. You didn't send anyone. I found out that no one would be charged with killing my daughter from the news." The room exhaled all at once. Soft gas, shifting chairs, a tear wiped behind trembling glasses. "I sat in my living room and watched you tell the country the grand jury had done its job," she said. "I watched it just like everyone else, except I wasn't everyone else. I was her mother, and you didn't think I needed to know first." Her hands clenched the photograph tighter now, her shoulders hunched forward, not weak, but bracing. "Do you know what that feels like?" she asked. "To learn your daughter's case is closed from a TV anchor before you've even been told by the people who made the decision?" Her voice cracked, but she kept going. Not for drama, because this was her only chance to speak in a room that had once shut her out. "It wasn't a justice process. It was a political strategy, one that you ran with your back turned to me, with your eyes on polls instead of on my child." Cameron sat frozen, not blinking, not writing, just enduring. "You didn't lose my trust because the law is complicated. You lost it because you didn't treat Breonna like a person. You treated her like a headline, like a liability." Now her anger came, not as a shout, but as quiet precision. "You didn't invite me to that grand jury room. You didn't even invite truth." She reached into her pocket and unfolded a handwritten note, creased and worn. "This is the speech I thought I'd give one day at her graduation from nursing school," she said. "It's not long, but I never got to read it, because bullets made her silence permanent before I ever got the chance." She didn't read it. She just held it up, then placed it on the table next to the photograph. "You were supposed to speak for her when she no longer could," she said. "But instead, you spoke for the system. You spoke for yourself." Her gaze softened, not out of forgiveness, but exhaustion. "I came here today not because I wanted to, but because you left me no choice." She looked across the panel now, to the lawmakers, to the press, to America. If we're not brave enough to say what happened to Breonna was wrong, then we are not worthy of the jobs we hold. Not as lawmakers, not as prosecutors, not as people. She placed the microphone down with both hands. No one spoke. Not Jasmine, not Cameron, Not even the clerk. It was the kind of silence that didn't need gavel or protocol. It didn't ask for response. It was the response. In that moment, there were no debates, no motions, no politics. There was only a mother, and the truth that had waited 3 years to be heard. The weight of a mother's truth doesn't fade when the microphone's cut. It reverberates, and by the time Tamika Palmer stepped out of room 2141, the echo of her words had already become aftershocks across an entire country. Before the hearing had even formally adjourned, the headlines had gone live. MSNBC's red ticker scrolled first. Daniel Cameron under fire for misleading grand jury in Breonna Taylor case. By the time Jasmine Crockett walked down the Capitol steps, CNN had pinned its top story. Congressional bombshell raises legal questions about former Kentucky AG. But what caught the most attention was Fox News, breaking from its usual tone, publishing the stark headline, "New Evidence Sparks Bipartisan Outrage Over Breonna Taylor Investigation." Across media, it wasn't just a report, it was a rupture. For the first time since the case had gone cold in public memory, it had re-entered the national bloodstream with undeniable force. And this time, it wasn't activists shouting into empty air. It was sworn testimony, internal memos, digital receipts, and the mother of a dead nurse who had just told the entire country that she found out her daughter's killers would walk free by watching TV. Social media erupted. Twitter, now rebranded as X, lit up with overlapping storm fronts of rage, grief, and reckoning. The hashtags trended by the hour. Cameron lied, grand jury gagged, she deserved justice, Madam Microphone was right. Clips of Jasmine Crockett holding up the leaked PAC email flooded Instagram reels. On TikTok, users layered her, quote, "Was it the law or was it November?" over protest footage, funeral images, and courtroom graphics. The real shift, though, came from inside the government. That same evening, 5 Democratic members of the House Judiciary Committee held an impromptu press conference on the Capitol steps. But they weren't alone. Standing to the side, not holding signs but signing the resolution itself, were 2 Republican lawmakers, James Calvert of Ohio and Monica Dillard of Colorado. Both centrists with law backgrounds, both visibly rattled by the day's hearing. "This is not about party," Calvert said. "This is about power being used to avoid truth. And if what we saw today holds under further scrutiny, then we are talking about obstruction dressed in official language." The statement drew immediate interest. Journalists pressed for confirmation. Would the committee recommend a referral to the Department of Justice? They didn't answer. Because just then, a bombshell arrived. Not on live TV, but in the inbox of a senior ProPublica reporter. A typed, unsigned 2-page letter. The return address, Frankfort, Kentucky. The source identified themselves only as a former high-level staffer in the Office of the Attorney General of Kentucky. The document was clean, direct, without emotion, but devastating in its content. We knew Breonna Taylor would never receive a homicide charge referral. This was not due to a lack of evidence, but a lack of will. From early planning meetings, staff was told the goal was to conclude decisively, without escalation. The phrase "manage political optics" appeared in multiple internal drafts of our communication strategy. One paragraph was underlined. "We were not told to seek justice. We were told to avoid consequences." By morning, the anonymous whistleblower letter had been verified by at least 2 sources familiar with internal deliberations. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic all ran simultaneous updates. Editorial pages filled with blunt questions. Did Daniel Cameron bend the justice system to shield a police narrative? Was the grand jury used not to deliberate, but to distract? More damning still, the Louisville Courier-Journal, Cameron's hometown paper, ran the following headline across its front page. "Breonna's justice was managed, not denied. Staffer says that was the point." And then came the voices from within. Senator Grace Hensley of Pennsylvania called for a Senate Oversight Subcommittee to immediately open a parallel inquiry. Congressman Elijah Burnett, DGA, filed a motion for the House Ethics Committee to issue a subpoena for all PAC-related communications between Cameron's office and outside law enforcement organizations. Even Senator Martin Voss, our Illinois, a known law and order conservative, acknowledged in a Sunday appearance on Meet the Press, if political funds were influencing prosecutorial boundaries in a murder investigation, then we need to be clear. That is not law enforcement. That is legalized betrayal. Outside government, legal organizations responded just as fast. The American Bar Association quietly released a statement of concern referencing Rule 3.8 of the ABA's Model Rules for Prosecutors. The decision to withhold charges that align with probable cause, particularly under political pressure, may constitute a violation of prosecutorial ethics and warrant disbarment. Meanwhile, civil rights groups went further. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund announced it was filing a motion to open an independent review of all prosecutorial decisions made under Cameron's tenure, starting with Breonna Taylor's case. But the most emotionally searing response came not from lawmakers or lawyers, but from Louisville itself. A candlelight vigil that began with 30 people outside the Jefferson County Courthouse turned into 5,000 by nightfall. Hundreds held signs that no longer asked for justice. They accused the system of having stolen it. Some held posters quoting Jasmine Crockett's line, "You didn't fail to serve justice. You denied this country even the chance to ask for it." Others carried photos of Tamika Palmer holding her daughter's picture. No slogans, just the image, just the truth. Back in Washington, the ripple effect grew. Talk of legislation resurfaced, dormant since 2020, now under the informal title, the Breonna Bill. Spearheaded by Crockett and co-sponsored by members of the Black Caucus, it sought to ban no-knock warrants nationwide, require full disclosure of all PAC contributions to elected prosecutors, and mandate federal review of any homicide cases closed without trial when new evidence emerges. Cable news called it a reckoning in real time. But inside Daniel Cameron's circle, it was a collapse. By day 5, 2 former deputies had resigned from his re-election committee. By day 6, the Kentucky Bar Association opened a preliminary investigation into professional misconduct. By day 7, Daniel Cameron, once considered a rising star, once floated as a possible Supreme Court contender, was described by The Hill as the first attorney general taken down by a mother, a microphone, and a paper trail. And Jasmine, she said almost nothing, declined every interview, issued no statement, until the following Monday, when a reporter caught her exiting the Capitol and asked, "How does it feel to bring this all to light?" She didn't slow down, but as she walked, she said, "It's not light, it's truth." And truth was always there. They just thought no one would drag it into daylight. And then she disappeared through the doors. No fanfare, no triumph, just justice, slowly, finally, catching up to power. The headlines had scorched through every corridor of power, and the smoke hadn't even cleared when the Justice Department stepped forward. Not with words of sympathy, but with subpoenas. On a cold Monday morning, just 8 days after the congressional hearing that upended a nation's conscience, the Department of Justice released a blunt, 6-line press statement. It wasn't dressed in political niceties or buried in legal jargon. The top line read simply, "The United States Department of Justice is formally reopening its investigation into the death of Breonna Taylor and the prosecutorial conduct surrounding the case." Cable news broke into coverage mid-segment. Phones buzzed in courtrooms. In Kentucky, Daniel Cameron was notified before the press even saw the announcement. A sealed federal summons was delivered to his legal team at 7:42 a.m. By noon, the official DOJ letter, stamped, signed, and marked urgent review, was public record. It cited potential violations of both the Civil Rights Act and federal prosecutorial ethics guidelines, explicitly naming withheld charging options, coordinated external influence, and grand jury obstruction by omission. In legal circles, the message was deafening. This wasn't just about what Daniel Cameron didn't do. It was about what he might have prevented others from doing. Reporters camped outside Cameron's home. Aerial footage showed his SUV leaving just after dawn, headed for an undisclosed legal office. No statement, no denial, only silence, and the hum of a defense team now fully activated. And then came the call no public figure wants to receive twice in a lifetime. Daniel Cameron was being summoned back to Congress. A second hearing, This time not as a subject of inquiry, but as the central witness in a bipartisan investigation tied to an active federal probe. He would appear before the Special Judiciary Oversight Subcommittee on Prosecutorial Misconduct, a body convened only 3 times in the past 2 decades, each involving high-profile government figures and suspected abuse of office. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m., room 1100 of the Hart Senate Building. Live broadcast, public, no redactions, and no prepared statements without approval. The chairwoman of the subcommittee? None other than Jasmine Crockett. When asked for comment, she offered only this. This time, the room won't go quiet because no one is speaking. It will go quiet because the truth will. As the date approached, the pressure mounted. Leaked internal memos showed the DOJ had subpoenaed every PAC communication sent to or from Cameron's office during the 5 months leading to the Breonna Taylor grand jury decision. Investigators had also requested server data logs, Slack archives, and encrypted messaging backups used by campaign advisors. Federal agents were reportedly re-interviewing former staffers, including the anonymous whistleblower who had revealed that optics, not justice, guided our process. By the Friday before his second appearance, public opinion had turned. According to a Gallup emergency poll, 67% of Americans believe Daniel Cameron had acted with political motivation rather than legal integrity. Among independent voters, the number soared past 75%. Louisville prepared for protests. Fences were erected around the courthouse. Yet no one threatened violence. No one called for revenge. Only one chant echoed at rallies across multiple states. Ask him under oath. The morning of the second hearing arrived under an overcast sky. The Capitol grounds buzzed with media. This wasn't just a political event. It was a reckoning now written into the machinery of federal oversight. As Daniel Cameron stepped out of the black sedan and into the long marble hallway of the Hart Building, the silence was suffocating. The same cameras that once followed him as a rising GOP star now panned slowly across his face, not for angles but for tremors. Inside, room 1100 had been packed since sunrise, not with activists or celebrities, but with lawyers, historians, ethics professors, retired judges, and the parents of victims who saw in Breonna's story a reflection of every system that had once passed them over. At exactly 9 a.m., the gavel came down. Jasmine Crockett opened the hearing with a single sentence. Let the record show that this proceeding does not begin with suspicion. It begins with the evidence already made public. Cameron sat, flanked by counsel, a stack of folders in front of him. But this time, he wasn't reading. He was listening. The first question came swift and direct. Mr. Cameron, on what legal basis did you omit homicide charges from the prosecutorial instructions given to the grand jury in the case of Breonna Taylor? He opened his mouth, but no answer came. Another question followed. Were you aware of any coordination between your office and political action committees in the weeks preceding your charging decision? Still nothing. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. We are not here to speculate about your intentions, she said. We are here to document your choices. And every moment you withhold clarity is another moment this country is reminded that justice in the wrong hands becomes a strategy, not a principle. The tension in the room was tangible. Every breath felt counted. Every silence now a statement of its own. Cameron finally leaned forward. I made the decision that I believed was right, based on the law. But Crockett cut in, not with anger, but with surgical calm. And did the law also instruct you to meet with the Fraternal Order of Police the same week their affiliated PAC sent your office funding recommendations labeled urgent? No response. Did the law advise you to notify the media before notifying Breonna Taylor's mother? Still nothing. Did the law tell you to exclude a murder charge from consideration while simultaneously drafting a press release that referred to the case as tragic but uncriminal? His lawyer leaned in, whispered. Cameron nodded but didn't speak, and so Crockett closed the folder. Then let the silence reflect the record. Outside, reporters spoke in hushed tones, not because they had nothing to say, but because, for once, the system was speaking for itself. And this time, it wasn't letting him walk out clean. Inside the hearing room, silence had sealed a man's fate. But outside in city squares and on courthouse steps, the silence was over, and a movement, long simmering, erupted with a single defiant cry. "We stand with Madam Microphone." It began as a whisper, a message typed in black font against a red background, shared by a grassroots group in Detroit. "We believe black women. We stand with Jasmine Crockett." Madam Microphone. Within 24 hours, it had become a rallying call across the country. Civil rights organizations, student groups, faith leaders, and survivors' coalitions flooded social media with a single unified image, a silhouette of Jasmine Crockett standing at a podium, her fist not raised in defiance but calmly gripping a microphone, weaponized not by volume, but by truth. By the end of the week, more than 120 coordinated marches and vigils had been planned. Cities like Atlanta, Oakland, Minneapolis, Newark, and Memphis declared local observance days. In Louisville, where Breonna Taylor's story began, an estimated 22,000 people gathered outside Jefferson Square Park, many holding candles in one hand and printouts of the leaked PAC email in the other. The signs said everything. "Truth isn't loud. You just chose not to listen." "Silenced women are still dangerous." "She spoke for all of us." "We stand with Madam Microphone." But these weren't just protests, they were declarations. In Birmingham, an 83-year-old civil rights veteran who once marched with Dr. King led a crowd through Kelly Ingram Park. "I haven't seen this kind of clarity since Selma," he said into a bullhorn. "They thought they could bury her under a nickname, but they didn't bury her. They crowned her." In New York, more than 10,000 people marched across the Brooklyn Bridge. At the center was a towering banner carried by black nurses and EMTs, many wearing photos of Breonna Taylor stitched into their scrubs. The banner read, "Your job should not be a death sentence. Your voice should not be a target." In Houston, high school students walked out of class at noon, forming a human microphone shape on their football field. Drones captured the image, which was broadcast across national television. Meanwhile, major organizations responded not with statements, but action. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Color of Change, ACLU, and Black Lives Matter Global Network held a joint press conference on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where they announced the formation of a new federal campaign, the Microphone Project, a multi-state voter mobilization and judicial reform coalition inspired by Jasmine's testimony and the movement that followed. "We're not here to praise a soundbite," said Sherilyn Eiffel, senior counsel with the NAACP. "We're here because a system tried to erase her by turning her voice into a punchline. But that voice spoke calmly and completely, and it cracked the shield of institutional deceit. And the energy wasn't limited to the streets. It lit up the screens. The phrase, Madam Microphone, once born in derision, now trended at #1 on X and TikTok for 6 consecutive days, not as mockery, but as a mantle. Art students across the country created digital tributes. One popular piece, a graphic of Jasmine's silhouette overlaid with courtroom documents in flames, was reposted over 1.2 million times. Independent musicians sampled her congressional quotes into protest songs, podcasts, poetry slams, spoken word events. All recentered Jasmine's voice not as an anomaly, but as a blueprint. Back in Washington, congressional aides reported an explosion of phone calls. Constituents flooded their representatives with demands. Investigate Daniel Cameron. Pass the Breonna bill. Expand protections for whistleblowers and prosecutors under PAC pressure. And outside Capitol buildings in more than 30 states, the same chant echoed. We stand with Madam Microphone. We speak with her now. Even media outlets, some of which had once minimized or mocked Crockett, pivoted. On CNN's State of the Union, a former federal judge declared, "She didn't grandstand, she grand uncovered." On MSNBC, Joy Reid called her the most unbought woman in Washington. Even the Wall Street Journal ran a rare op-ed acknowledging that Crockett's restraint under fire was not volume. It was volume measured in consequence. But perhaps most striking was a clip aired by PBS NewsHour, a quiet, devastating segment featuring 4 black mothers from 4 different states, all seated in a church basement. They weren't political experts. They weren't activists. They were grieving women who had lost children to law enforcement, who now saw in Jasmine something they hadn't seen before. She didn't just speak truth, one said. She didn't flinch when they called her names. She didn't yell back. She just stood there and told the story they've been trying to hide since slavery. That when a black woman speaks, they label it chaos so they don't have to hear the clarity. And that was the power now spilling across the nation. Not just that Jasmine Crockett had fought back, but that she had done so without becoming the thing they accused her of being. Loud, uncontrolled, unreasonable. She had been factual, surgical, unshakable, and the country had seen it. From college campuses to courtroom hallways, the slogan spread, not just as protest art, but as policy demand. Youth organizers launched campaigns encouraging voters to call their legislators, flood committee hearings, and sign petitions to expand oversight of state prosecutors. All under one headline, "We're not turning down the volume. We're making sure it finally counts." In a surprise move, the National Council of Black Churches dedicated its upcoming convention to the faith of justice, with Crockett slated as the opening keynote speaker. And at Spelman College, students began painting a mural, 20 feet high, of Jasmine holding a microphone over courtroom transcripts, with a quote from her first hearing scrawled beneath it. "Silence is what power asks for when it's cornered by the truth." But it wasn't hero worship. It wasn't branding. It was personal. People marched because they'd heard that silence before, in phone calls never returned, in police reports never finished, in courtrooms where names like Breonna were spoken only as logistics, not as daughters. And now, for the first time, someone had carried that silence into the halls of power and spoken over it, not with noise, but with proof. In Los Angeles, one woman summed it up best as she raised her sign to the sky. She took their nickname and made it a warning. So now, when you call her Madam Microphone, you'd better be ready for what comes through the speakers. As the chants faded from the streets and the microphones were lowered, the nation turned to one woman, hoping for a quote, a victory lap, a photo op. But Jasmine Crockett didn't show up for applause. She disappeared, into silence, into work, and into the one thing that still hadn't been delivered, the law. For days, networks had tried to book her. Primetime anchors left voicemails. Magazine covers drafted mock-ups with her silhouette in bold overlays. The woman who broke the wall. Congress's quiet hammer. The prosecutor they didn't see coming. But Jasmine declined them all. When CNN's senior political editor asked for an exclusive, she responded with a one-line email. "This isn't about legacy. It's about correction." When the New Yorker sent a long-form writer to shadow her, her assistant met them at the door and handed over a copy of the Breonna Taylor police report instead. It was annotated, red pen circling errors, omissions, timelines that never matched. She didn't need her name in print. She needed every sentence to finally speak the truth. For the first time in years, a public official was being called a symbol and rejecting it. Reporters begged her for 10 minutes of camera time. Producers called her staff, offering jet travel, wardrobe, hotel buyouts. Her answer never changed. "I didn't come to be a symbol. I came so that names like Breonna Taylor would no longer vanish into spreadsheets in silence." That was the only sentence she offered. Once, outside a committee chamber, when a group of journalists ambushed her with praise. She said it calmly, without anger or flair. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the same elevator she used before anyone knew her name. But while the cameras were watching elsewhere, she wasn't idle. Behind a locked office door in the Rayburn building, Jasmine Crockett went back to the beginning. Not of her own journey, but of Breonna's. She reread the original warrants, the 911 call, the medical reports, the grand jury transcript with entire sections blacked out. She didn't cry. She outlined, didn't post on social media. She drafted, didn't take a victory lap. She took red ink to a federal statute on prosecutorial immunity, and for every unanswered phone call from a morning show host, there was a returned call from a policy advisor. For every red carpet she declined, she walked into a closed-door meeting with legislative counsel. Because this wasn't a moment for posture. This was the window, the narrow one, the one that always slams shut after the press moves on. She wasn't about to let it close. For 2 weeks, her office lights stayed on until 2 a.m. Most nights she didn't go home. She ordered takeout and slept on the couch. The cleaning staff got used to her presence, tiptoeing around with vacuums as she cross-referenced DOJ findings with state-level criminal procedure loopholes. When her aide asked if she needed rest, she responded without looking up. Rest didn't save Brianna. Reform will. And so she built it, line by line. Not from politics, but from absence. The absence of accountability, the absence of transparency, the absence of urgency in every government official who had once called Breonna Taylor's death a tragedy and done nothing else. The bill she drafted wasn't long. It was sharp, surgical, and it was named exactly as it should have been, the Breonna Taylor Federal Accountability Act. It included mandatory full disclosure of all PAC communications with prosecutors and AGs, federal review authority over state-level grand jury proceedings involving use of force deaths, an automatic Department of Justice audit if a homicide charge is omitted in cases involving law enforcement, a whistleblower protection clause for prosecutors, clerks, or AG staff who report political interference. She didn't rush to announce it. She didn't hold a press conference. Instead, she walked it to the House clerk herself. No cameras, no press, just her and a leather folder. The woman behind the desk looked up, blinking. "Is this the bill everyone's been whispering about?" Jasmine nodded. "It's the one they hoped I wouldn't finish." And then she turned and left. Outside, the world kept spinning. Awards began arriving at her office. Journalism coalitions, civil rights foundations, legal ethics boards. One even included a golden microphone trophy with the words "Madam Microphone" engraved at the base. She sent it back with a handwritten note. Turn it into a scholarship fund. Name it after Brianna, because Jasmine Crockett didn't need to be the story. She needed the story to end differently next time. Not with a mother learning through a TV screen. Not with police reports doctored to fit press narratives. Not with a grand jury asking, "Why weren't we told we could indict for murder?" In the quiet that followed the hearings, she rebuilt a louder form of justice. One that didn't shout, one that didn't need a stage, one that fit in the black text of a bill, waiting to become law. And for the first time since Breonna Taylor's name became a symbol, the system she left behind began to look just a little less familiar, a little less untouchable, a little less rigged, because someone finally stopped fighting to be heard and started writing down what could never be silenced again. With the bill filed and the truth no longer trapped behind closed doors, Jasmine Crockett didn't hold a press conference. She didn't walk a red carpet. She returned instead to the place where silence had once ruled, where justice had once been buried in indifference, the Capitol steps. But this time, she wasn't walking alone. It was just past 7 a.m. when the first figure appeared at the base of the Capitol. The marble still held the chill of night. Washington was quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something it could neither schedule nor spin. No security barriers, no crowds, just the sound of footsteps on stone and the weight of a portrait wrapped in linen. It took 4 people to carry it, 2 older women, 1 man in scrubs, and a teenage boy with a Breonna Taylor pin on his jacket. They didn't say much. They didn't have to. Every movement was choreographed not in practice but in reverence. They unwrapped the cloth slowly, corners first until the full image came into view. Brianna, 26, calm, radiant, wearing blue. Her eyes gazed slightly upward, as if still waiting for the world to meet her there. Beneath the image, freshly inscribed in gold acrylic letters on deep black, she didn't get to live to tell the story, but someone told it for her. The words glowed faintly in the early light, not like neon, but like memory, alive, impossible to ignore. Someone knelt and positioned the base onto the 7th step of the Capitol's east staircase. That was the step her mother had once stood on, clutching the original lawsuit in trembling hands, flanked by no allies, drowned in noise. This time, the step was quiet, and this time, it would not be empty. Jasmine Crockett approached from the left, alone, her coat buttoned to the neck. No entourage, no aides, no notes. She didn't carry a microphone, just a folded sheet of paper in one pocket, the draft copy of the Breonna Taylor Accountability Act, and a handkerchief in the other. She didn't stand at the top of the stairs. She didn't place herself above the portrait. She stood just to the side of it, shoulder aligned as if to say, I'm not here to explain her story. I'm just here to make sure it was finally heard. A few more people arrived, quietly, a retired postal worker, a former prosecutor, a mother and daughter holding hands. Someone brought a candle and placed it at the foot of the frame. Someone else dropped a nursing school graduation pin in the corner. There were no speeches, no chants, just people arriving one by one, like pieces returning to a puzzle that had been scattered too long. And then, through the gentle crowd, a girl emerged. She couldn't have been more than 15. Slim, dark-skinned, wearing a simple sweatshirt that read, Madam Microphone taught me to speak. She didn't hesitate. She stepped toward the frame, then toward Jasmine. The two stood in silence for a long moment, the kind of stillness that felt like it stretched beyond time, across generations, across all the lives whose names we never heard. Then the girl spoke, barely above a whisper, but the words cut through the morning air like a vow. You didn't just hold the mic. You turned it into justice. Jasmine blinked once, slow. Her throat tightened, not out of pride, but out of grief that had never quite left her. Grief that didn't belong to her, but had passed through her, sharpened into something the system could finally feel. She looked down at the girl, not with awe, not with superiority, but with something closer to recognition. It's yours now, Jasmine said. The mic, the moment, the fight, it belongs to you. The girl nodded, and for a brief second, her fingers touched Jasmine's. Not a handshake, not a thank you, just contact. Real, grounded. A photographer nearby didn't lift their camera. They just watched, knowing some things weren't meant to be captured, only remembered. As the crowd grew, 50, then 100, then more, no one shouted. No one led. They simply stood together, shoulder to shoulder, not in anger, in alignment. Behind them, a choir of Howard University students began to hum softly. No lyrics, just harmony. It was A Change Is Gonna Come, but slower, more sorrowful, as if time itself were apologizing for being late. Jasmine remained on the step, beside Brianna's portrait, eyes fixed forward, not on the cameras beginning to gather at the edges, but on the horizon. The mall stretched out before her, like a long breath the country had held in for years. She exhaled, just once. The wind picked up slightly, brushing the edge of the portrait. For a second, the gold text shimmered again. She didn't get to live to tell the story, but someone told it for her. That someone was now standing next to the next someone. And from somewhere behind the crowd, a woman's voice rang clear, not loud but resonant. Let this step become a page. Let this portrait become a law. Let her name be followed by none. No one clapped. They didn't need to, because in that moment, something changed. Not in the bill, or the headlines, or the political calculus, but in the very space between power and people. It shrank, it breathed, and it finally listened. And Jasmine, who had once been called too loud, too angry, too much, said nothing, because the microphone had already done its job, and now it was standing in someone else's hands. As the portrait stood tall on the Capitol steps and the crowd began to thin beneath a rising sun, one truth remained, louder than applause, deeper than reform, and far more dangerous than silence. Justice in the hands of the right person doesn't just punish wrongdoing, it teaches the country how to feel again. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Breonna Taylor is not just about a courtroom or a headline. It's about the slow, grueling fight to make truth matter in a system built to forget. It's about how silence is not always absence. Sometimes it's engineered. And it's about what happens when someone dares to speak not louder, but longer than the system ever expected. Jasmine didn't just survive the insults, the threats, the smears. She metabolized them, turned every attack into fuel, every smear into steel. And every time someone told her she was too much, too loud, too black, too angry, she chose to stay in the room. That's what justice really looks like. Not the gavel, not the press release, but the choice to stay standing when the room wants you gone. What this story teaches us, what it burns into the national consciousness, is that power is not destroyed by rage alone. It is undone by endurance. Jasmine didn't outscream her opponents. She outlasted them. She showed up when it wasn't safe. She stayed seated when it wasn't easy. And when the moment came, she didn't erupt. She unfolded evidence, one sheet at a time, until no one could look away. The system had depended on her breaking, and she didn't. Because when your voice is tied to the dead, your silence is no longer an option. She carried Brianna not in her slogans, but in her spine. And there is a deeper lesson here, one that lives beyond the hearing room and marches. That when power is used to protect itself, truth becomes a threat. And when someone dares to speak that truth, calmly, surgically, they are called dangerous. That's the irony. Jasmine Crockett was never dangerous because she yelled. She was dangerous because she knew, because she read every line, because she refused to let a mother learn the fate of her daughter from a headline ever again. And for that, they tried to make her a punchline. What they didn't realize was you can't mock someone who's carrying the truth. You can only delay the moment when it breaks through. So what do we take from all this? That justice is not a destination. It's a decision, every day, to ask harder questions, to stay in uncomfortable rooms, to hold your ground even when you're the only voice not cracking. Jasmine Crockett didn't win because the system allowed her to. She won because she understood the system and then used its own rules against its silence. She showed us that the most revolutionary act in a broken democracy isn't chaos, it's clarity. And perhaps most important of all, this wasn't about making her a hero. Jasmine never wanted that. She didn't ask for statues or magazine covers. Her only request was this: that the next time a black woman is silenced in a courtroom or a mother buries her child and gets no answers, someone stays. Stays to ask, stays to listen, stays to document the betrayal until the country can no longer pretend it doesn't see it. Because if there's any final lesson from all of this, it's that truth doesn't die with the victims. It waits quietly for someone brave enough to carry it back into the light. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.